Hi, I'm Craig Payhoper and welcome to another edition of Inspired Achievers. Inspired Achievers exists primarily to be able to tell interesting stories from ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. Today's guest won't disappoint. One of his dear friends, Sir Tim Rice, famed international lyricist, once wrote these words for the Lion King in the circle of life. From the day we arrive on the planet and blinking step into the sun, there's more to see than can ever be seen, more to do than can ever be done. I don't think this man who is our guest today got the memo from his dear friend, because his entire life has wanted to push the boundaries or the limits of what's possible. He's tried to do more, to see more, and in the process, become more. He's travelled to 120 countries and had adventures that most of us will only ever dream of. One of those adventures saw him breathlessly chasing a unicycled man called Peter Tosh around his property in Jamaica. The same property where, sadly, Peter's life would be taken not too long later. A European crew in Germany saw and filmed Glenn mounting atop the Berlin Wall, striking a blow for freedom, along with many other people. Paul Simon, famed international singer-songwriter, was allowed this guest we're going to speak with as the only person who could interview him. He's been dressed in leaves, he's been painted by witch doctors in Borneo, and all of these adventures and a great many more have seen him become an accredited and multi-award winning travel writer. He once created and managed one of Australia's premier rock bands called Old 55. He co-wrote a song called Rockin' Christmas that made it to the #1 position on the Australian music charts. He's written for 300 publications around the world, including Penthouse and Playboy. I've been told on good authority that people who purchase those publications do so to read the articles. If that's indeed true at all, it is important then that we recognise this person as one of those people who's done that and contributed. He's written the liner notes for some 600 albums and compilations that have been selling around the world. He was crowned Rock Brain of the Universe 3 out of the 4 times it was ever on. It was an international competition, and in the end, when he decided to leave, it wasn't worth running it again. He's been a mainstay, a regular on Australian television channels and on the screens, and also on our airwaves on radio for 40 years. He was named in the Queen's Birthday Honours List and received one of the highest civilian honours the country can bestow in the Order of Australia. He's written 17 books and is midway through writing his 18th, and he's so generously allowed a pause to grant us this interview and talk to us today a little bit about what makes this man Glenn A. Baker.
Mate, it's great to be with you. I feel exhausted just hearing that. I think to myself, did I do that? Oh, no. I couldn't have. But yes, I guess I did. But the funny thing is, when I did it, I never thought about amassing a heritage, amassing a history. It was just what was available at the time and what I felt like doing. And yeah, the urge to do things, the energy comes from the desire to just be part of life.
Exactly. And the exhausting thing for me in preparing this interview was That doesn't even scratch the surface.
Yes, I know. It frightens me when I think about the number of places. You mentioned the countries I've been to, but there's also, well, within that and around that has been so many other pursuits to do with writing. When I started out travelling, I should say, many of the places I went to had a music content. So I went to Moscow in the final days of the Soviet Union with John Farnham, and sort of Annie Lennox and Chrissie Hynde and Peter Gabriel and all the others. And then I went on the road with the Rolling Stones in South Africa on their Voodoo Lounge tour. And then I went to a songwriting workshop in Havana, Cuba. And I hung out with, Bonnie Raitt and Jimmy Buffett and Burt Bacharach and Andy Summers and Mick Fleetwood and Peter Buck of R.E.M. and all that stuff. So at times they've meshed. And I went through a time when I thought, I will keep them separate. I will only travel as a travel writer and I will only do travel. But I found it very hard to maintain that delineation, so what I would do is I would be prepared to go in any circumstance, and people would pick up the phone and ring me and say, look, do you want to go? One of my great regrets is Kevin Jacobson,
yes,
the great promoter and former member of Col Joy and the Joy Boys. He rang me and he said, we're looking at bringing a North Korean circus act to Australia. And we need someone to go up to North Korea, to Pyongyang, and see them. And nobody in the office is prepared to go. But we wonder whether you would go. Mate, I'm packing my bags. I'm on my way. You bet I'll go. But anyway, talk about packing my bags, though. I was ready to go in the cab to go to the airport, and it got called off. And I never got to go to North Korea. One of the great regrets of my travelling life, actually. I mean, because I did go to so many other vital and important places and met some extraordinary people. And one of the things about travelling was, I got to hang out with Shenana Gusmao in East Timor and have him tell me the stories about being on the run from Indonesian military forces and then being jailed. He having given up his thing because he had kidney stones. He doesn't talk about that very often. But anyway, but that, and I have met, the Sultan of Brunei. And I bowled up to him in a Bandar Seri Begawan Park and I said, I'd like to give you the greetings from the people of Australia. Oh, I was a presumptuous bastard, I was. I give you, and of course, why I would do that for someone who actually owns a property in Australia bigger than Brunei, I have no idea. But anyway, but he was great, he was smart. He was at that time the second richest man in the world. I think he's been overtaken by a few people then. But anyway, he was going off to lead a fun run. Now there's a contradiction in terms of ever I've heard one, through the streets of the city. And I joined him and I lasted about a block or two before I...
Well, at least you entered.
Well, there's something with my oldest son, Orson, and I told him at an early age, and we've had discussions about this, and I think he personifies this too. You should never be in awe of anybody. Everybody gets up in the morning and has to brush their teeth and have to go to the loo. Yeah, everyone is basically human and alive. And so I can walk across the room to anybody and talk generally about something that I know that they would like, and they respond and they want to. Now I've done that with rock stars and with leaders of nations and with it's a whole range of people, and it's worked for me incredibly well. And Orson, my son, does the same thing too. Mm-hmm. He's not in awe of anybody. It's a good way to go through life, I think.
What was it like walking up against the tide of people to meet Frank Sinatra?
Oh, wow. Okay, Frank Sinatra. A lovely story. The ultimate concert.
Yes.
Mike Gore, White Shoe Brigade, and paid $1 million, $1 million to have Frank Sinatra come and perform in Australia. Now, Frank Sinatra, on his previous time in Australia, had been, well, we've all seen the film and read the stories, etc. I mean, sort of like Bob Hawke had to come and persuade the union movement to let him out of the country, because he called female journalists, buck-and-a-half hookers and all sorts of things like that. But anyway, he wanted to prove that everything had been forgiven. Everything had been forgiven, and he was all fine. So he decided at the very last moment, the afternoon of the concert, that he would do a press conference. And so Patty Mostyn, the publicist, came to me and she said, right, he wants somebody from Variety magazine. I said, well, I don't write for Variety. I'm the Australian editor of Billboard. She said, yes, but you're writing for Variety now. I said, whatever you say. So we all got in a bus and we drove down the hill. And on the way down the hill, a lot of these really senior writers were saying, you wait till we see him. We're going to, how dare he speak about our female journalists like that, leading me to believe this could be an interesting altercation. We all sat on wooden benches. He comes out, it's one of the shortest press conferences in history, I should point out, and he comes out and basically they were in awe. Could not, Anyway, he said, he got up to go, and I had the program of the event, and as he was about to leave, I leapt to my feet. I was right in front of him. I said, Frank, would you sign this for me? And his personal publicist said, Mr. Sinatra to you. I said, okay, Mr. Sinatra, would you sign this one? And he gave me one of those looks and said, there's one in every crowd. But it was like a bit of a grin, and he signed it for me and he gave it back to me. But what was interesting is we got back in the bus and drove back up the hill.
Yes. All
these guys that were going to give Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, a really tough time, formed a queue to walk up the back. They'd been touched by, the hand of God. You could tell they just wanted to touch the program. They were quite in awe of the situation. So that night, by the way, he was just spectacular. And his support act was Peter Allen. Interestingly enough, and you mentioned Penthouse in your introduction, he was back in Sydney and I was back in Sydney, and I sat down with Peter Allen in a hotel room by Sydney Harbour and did the Penthouse interview with Peter Allen. And he was just gorgeous, but he gave me a great quote. And he talked about his time being married to Liza Minnelli. Yes. And he said that Liza Minnelli, he said, she could pick a chair up and move it across the room with more grace and charm and presence than anyone else in the world. He said she was just a remarkable human being. And so that was one of the things. I've done interviews with a whole lot, many people, but some of them stand out particularly. Paul Simon, you mentioned. Paul Simon was in fact being given a really hard time because the cultural boycott of South Africa, ignoring it. And he was saying that, I remember him saying to me, you cannot turn culture off like a tap. Culture will flow. You have to acknowledge it. But then again, Bob Dylan also told me although I can't, if you want me to tell you anything about what Bob Dylan said, I can't, because I've forgotten. I was in awe. I was in awe. What I do remember is going in the labyrinthine passageways of the Sydney Entertainment Centre to interview him. I collided with somebody and that person ended up on the ground. And when I leaned down to lend a hand, apologising profusely, Stevie Nicks looked up to me through a hooded eye and sorry, Stevie. That's funny. I remember knocking the wind out of Stevie Nicks more than I remember my conversation with Bob Dylan. That was an extraordinary thing.
But going back to Dylan for a moment, at age 13, you started hearing his music and it changed your life.
At 13, I heard like a rolling stone. And all of a sudden, I mean, the allegory, sort of like the opaque nature of it, the stream of consciousness was so extraordinary that I knew that wherever my life, I remember I was 13 at the time, it would have to have something to do with words, because before that it was all moon, June and spoon. I mean, even the beloved Beatles, she loves you, yeah, 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 okay, fine. But Dylan, like a rolling stone, that was taking me and the rest of the world into a whole new dimension. And so, and I can remember when the first tour that I saw him live on, I didn't see the 665 tour when he came out here with the band, but I saw him when he came out here in 73, and I was up in Brisbane, and I was in the press seats, and he started playing. The second song was Mr. Tambourine Man, and the guy I was sitting with said, "Glenn, are you crying?" And I had tears rolling down my face. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man. 14 years of my life was flashing in front of my eyes. To say that Bob Dylan had an effect on me doesn't quite explain it. I mean, Bob Dylan has always been like that in my life, and I've always been. And one of the things I live in fear of, I get called upon, as you probably know, to write eulogies and to do interviews and etc. when people have died and people in music. Well, it's going to happen eventually with Bob, and it almost frightens me. I even think now, what will I say? How will I try and sum up, sort of like, what that man meant to me? It's going to be very, very impossible.
I accept that, but the wonderful thing about the way you write obituaries is that you find a way to give them a place, to give them a sense of value. And so very few people can do that.
You know what? It's interesting you should say that. Not just so much in obituaries, but I remember some years ago, a guy came up to me. He said, "Look, Glenn, you don't know me from Adam. I'm about the same age as you, and I like basically the same people as you." And he said that when I was growing up, he said, my father, my grandfather, and my school teacher, and my parish priest, whatever, they all said, look, this is just rubbish. It'll pass. It has no value. No, give it up. Ignore it. It's of no. He said, but I kept at it. He said, but I believed in it. He said, one day, he said, I'm turning on television or turning on radio. He said, and there are you talking about something in rock history, but you're doing it with, there was articulation, with a passion, with an intensity. And he said, and all of a sudden I realised, yes, that's how I feel. That's how he said, and from that moment on, he said, I felt better about what I've grown up with. And I think that's told me at that point where I fit into the scheme of things. Now, I've done television, as you say, for 40 years, and I've done radio, and I've written obituaries, but I like to think I can put things into perspective. I can actually explain where things, why they fit, why they mean, why they're important, and somebody's got to do it. And I suppose more people do it now, but perhaps can I say nobody's done it quite with my passion and enthusiasm. Perhaps I've done it,
Well, I had the chance to meet John Farnham, one of Australia's great voices, and I got him to autograph a photo of you and him at the ARIA Awards, holding up some of those awards. And the moment he saw me and saw the picture, he rehearsed to me a story that you shared with him. He wanted to do the goose step in Russia, and he said, I don't think they appreciated it very much. But he did say something that stayed with me about you, and that is the thing that separates you from a lot of other journalists and what have you, or critics, is that first and foremost, you're a fan.
Yes.
A fan of music,
Yeah.
Like you even memorised from an early age the names in brackets. on record
I would get
labels.
records, and there was, I wasn't, every other person would just read the name of the artist. I would read what was in brackets, who wrote the song, and then the name of the publisher, and then the producer. And I cared. I really did care. And when it came to writing liner notes, and when it came to, to do radio shows, I mean, that all really was vitally important to me understanding. To understand, not Be My Baby by the Ronettes is one of the most famous records and one of the most perfect records ever made. However, knowing all about Phil Spector, the man who produced it, is also very important too. And I think that's I guess what I've done. I've tried to remember who actually produced and wrote and arranged and all those things. And I mean, maybe that sets me apart. I say that nowadays other people do it, but perhaps when I started out, I was the only one.
Well, I dare say not everyone would have the same affinity, the same passion. I remember the interview you did with a man you said you felt like he'd waited his whole life to be interviewed by you, Roy Orbison.
Oh, yeah.
And you were...
well, that's presumptuous of me to even say that, forgive me. But yeah, no, but he could give you that impression. He could do that. He could actually, to anybody that he actually chose to, he could make you feel he'd waited his whole life to be interviewed by you. And he was a dream of a man, no question.
Well, didn't his manager write you a letter and say it was amongst the top interviews he's ever given?
He's ever given, that's right. Yes, it was released on a record, and it was, but we hit it off. What was supposed to be a 20-minute interview went for about sort of over an hour, and we locked eyes. And he told me a great story about trying to get Only the Lonely recorded, and he offered it to the Everly Brothers, and they, oh yeah, okay, no, it's not really us. And then he goes to Graceland, calling into Memphis on his way to Nashville to record it, and he presses the button of the gate, and Elvis says, oh, hi Roy, listen, he said, we had a party last night and everyone's laying all over the place. He said, it's all a bit messy. He said, why don't I just catch up with you in Nashville? I said, were you upset by that with Roy? From Elvis? He said, yes, I was. He said, I thought he showed me a degree of disrespect. However, he said he gets to the studio and he said the Everly Brothers had turned it down. Elvis plainly didn't want to hear it. So, dum 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 de doo. It became his first ever #1 record.
And what a #1.
But I love it when people tell you those stories. Yeah. They tell you the insight. They tell you I mean, you mentioned, and while we were setting up here, Ray Charles. And I can remember going to his office in Watts, the worst part of Los Angeles. And I'm sitting at a desk and he's tapping out rhythms on the desk and he's singing to me. And all around me on the walls and the top of the cabinets is plaques, citations, achievements, nothing as tacky as the gold and platinum record. These are from kings and queens and the rulers of the world, and they're all gathered around. And I said to myself, Ray, what's the meaning of soul? I figured that, well, you climb a mountain to a cave where the wisest man is inside the cave and you ask him the meaning of life. So if you go to all this trouble, why don't you ask Ray about the meaning of soul? And he gave me this lovely answer. He said, and I paraphrase it instantly, and I say, it's when you feel something so real and so honest and so true that anyone listening to it knows that you had to have been there. You had to have done that. Now, of course, he didn't. Yes. He'd live everything he loved. A lot of great writers wrote the songs for him. But actually, he would give that impression. And at one point he got up and he danced around the room with me. He gave me a bear hug, and it was just the most wonderful experience. I mean, there are things I'm writing about in my autobiography at the moment, and I'm having good fun. But the recollection is very difficult.
There's so much of it.
Because there's Funny you should say that. Funny you should say that, my dear friend. There is so much of it. And, what can I say? But you're doing the interview, so it's your turn.
I had the privilege of meeting Mikhail Gorbachev, and I remember coming over
Well done.
I remember coming
That beats me. I didn't meet Gorbachev.
Well, I was so happy and proud, and he autographed his biography for me.
Yeah.
And I learnt 3 Russian words, and I said them to him, and he put his hands on my shoulders and went, ha, ha, ha. And he was chuffed. So he signed his biography, handed it to his wife, she autographed it, and within 6 months, she passed from leukemia.
Okay. Yes, right, I didn't know that.
But I remember telling you, and you went, wait, and you disappeared and came back. Tell me the story of meeting Fidel Castro.
Right. Okay, Fidel Castro. I was in Havana, Cuba, and it was a songwriting workshop called Music Bridge. And Andy Summers of the Police and I, we would go out by day with our cameras and take photographs in the denuded streets of Havana. But we suspected there was a chance that we might meet Fidel. So we bought one of his speeches, History Will Absolve Me. And a chance did arise. During the afternoon, I went to a baseball match that was put on, an exhibition match by America, and he was there, and I could see him in the distance, and I thought, well, that was as close to Fidel as I was going to get. However, that night, after a concert at the Karl Marx Theatre, we were put in a bus and we were taken up the hill to meet Fidel. Now, it's a great story. If I do say so myself, it's a great story. And I, of course, had my inside coat pocket. We went through we weren't supposed to take anything in. Went through a metal detector, but a book is not made of metal, and I got through. But anyway, I'm lining up with a few people to meet him, and most of the Americans, Bonnie Raitt was an example, Jimmy Buffett, etc. They tend to have a conservative American, Mr. President. How are you, Mr. Because they have a president, so anyway. I bowled up, threw open my arms and said, Fidel, I'm Glenn, I'm from Australia. Hey, I'm a writer, nice to meet you. And his eyes lit up because he loves Australia. Susie Moroney, the swimmer, had swum across from Miami. And so basically we had a connection, an instant connection, and we laughed, and he another one who gave me a bear hug.
Excellent. We
laughed and we joked, and then I said, and he's surrounded by guards. I said, and so sorry, you're a writer. Remember, he had met Hemingway, so we discussed Hemingway. Wow. We got to discuss Hemingway with Fidel Castro. There's something you don't do every day. And I said, yeah, well, I'm a writer. I've written, I think, about 13 books. He said, what do you write on? I said, I write on music and travel and humour and family. I said, would you send me one? I said, yes, Fidel, of course I will. Oh, by the way, and I plunged my hand suddenly into my inside coat pocket. Let me repeat that. I suddenly plunged my hand into my inside coat pocket. The phalanx of guards lifted their AK-47s or their Kalashnikovs, whatever they had, cocked them, pointed them, aimed them. I was about to be turned into a postage stamp. I was about to become perforated. Really, this was going to be an international incident. However, Fidel could see what I was doing, and he waved down his cards and he smiled. So we got the book and he wrote in, por favor, your friend Fidel. And it was, but I can remember when I left, Bonnie Raitt, who could be quite formidable, came up to me and said to me and Andy, let's see. And we were a bit worried because Andy was behind me, and he basically said, okay, you did it for him, could you do it for me? Yeah, so Fidel signed his book too. But we thought that Bonnie Raitt was going to take the books and we weren't going to get them back. However, she did. Okay, and looked at them, she gave them back. Nice. But like I said, of all the people I've met, meeting Fidel was a pretty extraordinary experience, and I mean he's gone now.
Yes.
And it's that's the thing. So many of the people that I've actually encountered are no longer with us. And one of the things I do these days, and I've started writing quite a few obituaries for the Sydney Morning Herald, and you're right, I give them a humour, but also I came from the old school that you don't speak ill of the dead.
Yes.
So when I write an obituary, I do not go what a young journalist was trying to make a name for themselves will go and try and dig in, and I don't do that. I don't do that. So basically, people who read it, they want to know why somebody was important. They want to know how he fits into the scheme of everything. They want to know sort of like things that are vital, and that's what I give them. And so it's it does worry me now that it leaves me to worry. When I go, who's going to write my autobiography or my obituary, I should say.
Well, let me say, you've met many of the world's movers and shakers.
Well, not only, by the way, can I tell you one of the great moments?
Yes, please.
It's a rock and roll moment. I'm in Johannesburg, Ellis Park in South Africa, and I've interviewed all four of the Stones one by one, and I'm standing around backstage, and basically, and the backstage at the Rolling Stones concert, I mean, they have everything, dartboards and pool table and their favourite lounge, everything to make them feel like on long journeys away from home, that they're actually at home. But I must have been standing around looking a little bit lost. So Keith Richards, who was the best of the interviews that I did, came over. He threw his arms around my shoulder and he just says, "Hey Glenn, how you going, mate? Are they taking good care of you? Is everything fine?" And in a moment, in a nanosecond, it flashed through my brain that here was Keith Richards inquiring about the state of my well-being. I thought, it doesn't get much better than that. But by the way, with Keith, I was able to fill a role that not many journalists get to do. I was able to fill him in on something that had bothered him for quite some time. And I said, well, Keith, the last time I saw you, you were in Randwick Racecourse, and you were in a gold carriage with the Stones, and you were coming down the racetrack to play the show. He said, on the flight over from Perth, one of your Aussie girls had dropped some smack on me. So I hesitated in using sort of a naughty, but however, he was Keith Richards, whatever. Anyway, he said, I played well. He said, because I checked the tape later, and he said, and I played well. He said, but all I can remember, he said, is 4 blurry white things. So you're telling me they were horses' asses? Thanks, man. And I thought to myself, is he taking a piss? Is he actually sending me up? But no, he'd often wondered why in that gold carriage going to the stage at the concert in Sydney, what those blurry white things were that were in his brain. And I thought, well, I was able to perform a role there, a role of some importance.
And then you said, it doesn't get any better than Keith Richards with his arm around your shoulder.
It truly doesn't. It doesn't.
But then the Who want to sing you happy birthday.
Yeah. Well, I had written a story about when Pete Townsend came to Australia with the Who in 1968, and they tried to throw them out of the country. They treated him really bad. And he said that he would never, ever return. And for about 3 decades, he didn't. He didn't return. And then finally, he agreed to come back on a Who tour. And I was out, and I went backstage. I wrote a story, it was in The Australian, blow by blow of what happened. And he had me backstage. He said, no, it was a great story. He said, and basically he said, yeah, apart from a couple of tiny things, you were right. That's exactly how it happened. And he said, and it was really, really good. I might just mention that, Roger Daltrey was there, but it wasn't in the same league as meeting Chairman Pete. I mean, Pete. Anyway, I go outside and I'm sitting watching the show, and I think it was around about at the mixing desk. And the guy I was with elbowed me. I might have drifted off, as I tend to say, hang on, Glenn, he's talking about you. He's talking about you. And anyway, so he was saying, and then Glenn said, and then I said, and he's recounting to this entire, it was at Homebush, entire stadium, this conversation that we had had about that. And I don't know whether he actually sang happy birthday to me, but like I said, he certainly mentioned me, and he celebrated me on stage, and that was pretty extraordinary, I must admit.
Wow. So let's backtrack a little. You've done these incredible things, and we haven't even touched on what it was like to sit on inside Kate Bush's home on her floor. But
dear, Kate Bush's, yeah. We won't even go there.
Or sit on the floor listening to a Canadian songstress sing. And
dear Joni, yeah. Well, I used to go to press conferences all the time, and they used to take advantage of me and to say, whenever I was slowing down a bit, Glenn, you ask a question. So I'd get up and I'd ask a question, and basically I saved many a press conference. The publicist's dream was to have me there in the front row that they could throw to. But one of them was at the Siebel Townhouse, and it wasn't a press conference in a way. We weren't all sitting in sort of like in chairs and rows and things like that. But a half a dozen of us were picked to interview Joni Mitchell and sit cross-legged at her feet. Now, I don't do lotus position very well, trust me. So it was not easy for me to get down in a lotus position. But she sat, but you don't ignore when Joni Mitchell asks you to sit and listen. And she played and she sang, and it was, I mean, I write about that in the book and talk about other things. At a David Bowie press conference, he's actually pointing out how much he loved my hat. 'Cause I talked about him taking his band and dressing them in a Carnaby Street boutique, and he said, yeah, he said, it's always important to dress, like he said, your hat, love your hat, sort of thing, and I rather like that. And so there were many occasions, I mean, Dolly Parton, tiny thing, but she gave me another, I love bear hugs, gave me another bear hug. How do I put this gently? Leaving me in no doubt that she was all Dolly. She was all Dolly. And so basically, look, at times the press conferences didn't always go the way. The Sex Pistols reformed, and they came out here, and I was in the audience, and I decided that I got up and I said, the questions that circulated about you throwing up on old ladies in airports and things like that, were they true, or was it British urban myths? And Johnny Rotten says, no, he was an old man. And everybody loved that. So anyway, my role always was to get people. But sometimes, by the way, it worked out. I went to a Michael Bolton press conference. Now, I'm not normally into Michael Bolton or whatever. However, maybe the publicist wanted me there. And I asked Michael this question about co-writing a song with Bob Dylan, because it was my interest, and I thought he wanted to know that. His answer went on for about 20 minutes. People were falling asleep. Anyway, I go home later that afternoon, dinner's on, the boss is saying, he rings me up and he says, mate, you've made a best friend there. Oh, wow. He said, and he wants you to go on the road with him. He said, and he said, basically be out to the airport. So I went on the road with him. Now, we won't go into the whole story of it, but he didn't treat fans just the way that I was accustomed to. And soon after that tour, I went on the road with John Farnham, and that was a whole different situation as well. However, he treated me really, really, really nicely. and we went. I can remember going across to Nullarbor in his private jet, and at Adelaide, perhaps, or Perth, going backstage and helping him select shirts to wear. I became his second best friend in the whole world.
Wow.
By the way, the magazine had said to me, "Oh, can you ask him about his girlfriend, Nicole Sheridan?" So it was into one of the many, many things I asked him. And when I wrote the story, it was like I mentioned, second last in the story. However, when it appeared, the story was all about her. And I read it and it was nothing that I'd written. It seems, they'd rewritten it entirely. Nicole, my true love, they got what they wanted, but I had nothing to do with it. I was merely the person who, they could use my name. Well, they didn't get to use my name again. Yeah. I didn't write for that sort of publication, and I've written for lots and lots of publications.
Over 300.
Yeah, but I would never write for those women's magazines.
Well, your inside information really made the difference between when you were interviewing Michael Crawford. He'd had a day full of tell us about Frank Spencer.
Yes, or else tell us about Phantom of the Opera.
Phantom of the Opera. And you go in and say, what was it like being a flatmate with John Lennon?
Yeah, and making a film, How I Won the War. And again, his eyes lit up. Oh, wow, fantastic. And basically he told me this great story about, he said, we would go into town when we were shooting in Spain. He said, and we would get in the car, he said, and before we got there, John would have to be on the floor. And we knew we would get about 60 seconds in the shop in whatever we were going before the hordes came in. He said, and so basically he would get up, run in, grab a few things, and then, wow! But he told me, but he'd been waiting for years to tell anybody about this story, about being, and then being where he wrote Nowhere Man, and in the digs with Frank Spencer, so to speak, with Michael Crawford, and it was a wonderful experience. But like I said, I found it also with Phil Collins. I like to get albums signed. And I do in fact, I have a Facebook page and I put them up. And but one of the first things he did before even Genesis was the band Flaming Youth, an album called Arc 2. They're a quasi-moody blues outfit. And they did an album and it had inserts that were like stained glass window inserts made out of plastic. Really. Anyway, on the back is a photo of Flaming Youth, and they've all got long hair, locks and locks of long hair, including Phil Collins. And I gave it to Phil and he grimaced and he goes, he wrote on the back, "Dear Glenn, you make me feel so young!" exclamation mark. But we had great. He's a huge Beatles fan. He came out here to do Frauds, the film Frauds, and we would speak on the phone at night, and he would talk about his favourite Beatle bootlegs, and because he knew all, and he'd been on the Prince's Trust, with sort of like with ex-Beatles, etc. And so we caught up again recently on his recent tour, and we still talked about the Beatles, But like I said, but getting things signed. See, I can remember being in New York once, and Truman Capote was signing things, and there were queues outside the blocks, and all these women were in ermine and pearls, and I had no problem at all. And I thought, well, if they can do it, I can do it. So I would get there, and basically AC/DC would get a live at the Atlantic Studios live album, and Angus would do a caricature of himself as a devil with horns and a tail and things like that. But one of my favourite things is it was at the Imperial Peking Harbourside restaurant in Sydney for a lunch with Billy Joel. Now, Billy Joel has a great feeling for Australia. We broke him, sort of like, Piano Man was first to hit in Australia. And I remember there was a whole bunch of people from Sony were there, and I think Molly was there, and I think that Richard Wilkins was there. But basically, like the good Australians we were, we acknowledged him when he sat down, but then we went on to talk to each other and whatever. He was just another guy at lunch, and he said, and he basically made the point. He said, if this was in America, he said they'd all be going, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. They'd all be, sort of like. He said, but I love you guys. You guys just go on and do what it is you want to do. And he said, and he meant it too. He really loved it. But I had the first of 2 albums that his Long Island bar band, the Hassles, made when he was Billy Joe Noel. And I gave it to him, and it was a beautiful copy. So he got a black felt pen and he wrote on it, where the bloody hell, may not have been bloody, I can't remember, where the hell did you get this, Billy Joel, and handed it back to me.
Lovely.
And I thought, so that was actually, that was rather nice. People, I think the one thing, when I actually pull out something like the first album they made or something rare, it lets them know that this isn't just their number one hit album, but you're a fan. You're someone who knows,
And cares.
You know and you care. And that, I think, has been the secret in many of the interviews I've done. They know instantly or soon. Roy Orbison was exactly the same. They knew when I started asking him questions about, let's not go into it now, but all the questions about, his Sundays. And he knew that I knew. He knew that I cared, And basically, there is something really, really quite. I was on a thing called Rock the Boat 6 a couple of years ago. It's going to be a few years ago now. And I had to do an interview with PJ Proby. And I started talking about how he got the name PJ Proby and how Jackie DeShannon, who was a good friend of mine and a hero of mine, she was one of the people who came up with the name. Anyway, he was away. No one had ever asked him. They just all asked him about his hit record, whatever. So I couldn't shut him up. Could not shut him up for all of it. And that's basically been the case with so many of the interviews I've done. You can't stop people once they get started, because trust me, a lot of people, particularly when they're in big positions, they do endless interviews, answering all the same questions.
Yes.
Answering all the same questions. So when somebody asks them something that they hadn't heard before, or that indicates an element of of interest and awareness of their career,
Just touching on the Roy Orbison interview, there was a time he was rehearsing names back for the interview, just saying, oh, this person was involved. You corrected him and said, wasn't it this person? And he said, you know what? I'm so glad you're here.
and to be told that by Roy Orbison was pretty amazing.
It was clear he didn't want to deny the credit going to the right person.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm just so glad you're here. But look, if we can backtrack a bit.
We've gone on it's kind of like a pinball machine. There's a ball going ping, pong, ping, pong, ping, pong, all over the place. We have no idea where we're going to go next.